Rewatchability is to filmmaking what brand recognition is to tech firms. It's like a mark of dependability and quality that guarantees a captive audience, which is where familiarity breeds love. So, of course, filmmakers seek to make their films as rewatchable as possible. Take a director like Edgar Wright, for example. He packs his movies with so many hidden details and jokes that you simply wouldn't notice the first time around, and that makes each new viewing a rewarding experience. Then again, that doesn't mean that every single great movie is something you'd happily go back to experience all over again. Because not every story told is one you necessarily want to hear again. And some are so downright harrowing that you barely want to relive their memory, let alone watching them all over again. So with that in mind, I'm Ellie with Whatculture, here with 10 incredible movies you'll never watch again, and why. Number 10. Mother. Darren Aronofsky seems to these days be drinking from the same cup as Nicholas Winding Refn or Lars von Trier, in that his chief goal is to provoke. In fact, just like those two, he seems intent on that end at the cost of traditional cinematic form, which invariably delights his ardent fans. Mother might as well be the flagship movie of that agenda, given its targeting of organised religion, its fetishistic violence and hysteria, and its occasionally impenetrable logic. It's well made and profound and impactful, and critics loved it, but it is not, in any way, enjoyable in the conventional sense. In fact, it is quite the opposite, and that's sort of the point. But why you'd ever subject yourself to that sort of sensory assault again without anything sweet to sugar it is anyone's guess. Number 9. The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas. There is no sense denying the fact that The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas is effective in its twisty agenda to make you feel even the slightest sense of the enormity of the horrors of the Holocaust, but it's not something you'd ever want to revisit recreationally. Part of the problem of the story, which adapts John Boyne's same-title book about two 8-year-old boys on either side of an extermination camp's barbed wire, is that when you've heard it, it loses its impact. And it only loses its impact because it is so deeply, horrifyingly traumatic. You're led to feel some slight flicker of hope that young Shmuel will get out and he and Bruno can reclaim their normal lives. But then the actual ending drains every ounce of positivity of you as both boys end up dead. And not only is it sad, but it invites you to only feel some vague perverse triumph in the fact that Bruno's father, one of the camp's commander, pays for his almost flippant inhumanity with his own son's life. And feeling that is awful in itself. Number 8. Dunkirk. As a cinematic masterpiece conveying the emotional narrative of a historical moment, without necessarily sticking too closely to the facts of history, Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk is unrivaled. It is an achievement in visual, scale, and particularly sound that is a full-blooded assault on the senses. But to that end, it's also almost entirely unrewarding in any kind of sentimental terms. Yes, it is unbelievably arresting and utterly captivating, but it's also chiefly motivated to make its audience feel the same building unease and anxiety of its individual subjects, without fully telling their stories. It's a series of emotional vignettes knitted together in a way that leaves too much of a mark to be in any way purely enjoyable. And there's also the fact that it actually loses some of its impact away from the cinema. Watching it on an iPhone screen sat on a train doesn't quite build up the tension in the same way, and poor Christopher Nolan would be having a breakdown with that knowledge. Number 7. The Passion of the Christ. Whether you care to call it Mel Gibson's passion project in the name of his devout religious beliefs, or a vital narrative reflecting on human condition, or a vehicle for indoctrination, The Passion of the Christ is well made. It looks incredible at times, and Jim Caviezel's performance as Jesus Christ is stunning, particularly as he's rarely been as captivating, and it does tell a compelling story, but it's also engineered to make you feel something very particular. Guilt. There's something definitely distasteful in there, and it's way too perversely fetishistic of violence, but it never preaches, to its credit. The issue though is that it is intentionally excruciating, and after a while, that just becomes too much of a slog, particularly when it's also trying to remind you that you did it, sort of. Number 6. Blue Valentine. From one excruciating film to another of an entirely different kind. Blue Valentine is an utterly spellbinding story of blossoming romance, all volatile and fresh and exciting, wrapped up in a story of catastrophic, heartbreaking destruction of the same relationship. It's a simultaneous bookend showing Ryan Gosling's Dean and Michelle Williams' Cindy growing apart as it explains how they came together. Thanks to the intense chemistry between Williams and Gosling and the succinct brilliance of their performances, you feel every spark of magic and every devastating blow. And by the end, as you watch Dean walk away broken, the emotional toll it takes on you is really not something you'd ever want to relive. Number 5. The Machinist. The Machinist is arguably doomed to only ever be remembered for the intensity of Christian Bale's commitment to performing in it. He famously, or infamously, dieted for 4 months, dropping a third of his body weight by eating only an apple a day, with some water, a coffee, and occasionally a whiskey. The result was exactly what you'd expect of someone who ate less than 100 calories most days. He looked painfully skeletal and dangerously close to death. There's no denying it made for an incredible performance, but it's incredibly hard to watch because that bodily cost is not something you can fake. The film's intent is to capture a traumatized, traumatic psychological state, and it does it so well that there's no way anyone in their right mind would ever want to revisit it. Number 4. Manchester by the Sea. Like Blue Valentine, Manchester by the Sea is a deeply affecting, horribly traumatic movie without ever wading into provocative, emotionally lurid waters for the sake of impact. It merely feels like a deeply, deeply sad story about troubled characters in such a way that it gets into your bones and breaks them from the inside. It's essentially a story of how one wound that would be difficult enough to bear, the death of a family member at a young age and the effective orphaning of his son, tears open older wounds of the brother charged with being the guardian of his nephew. And despite this sort of setup usually leading to a revelation and a happy ending, Manchester by the Sea just piles on the misery until Casey Affleck's lead realizes he cannot have his epiphany. It's a sad, hollowing full stop, and by then you're so wrung out, repetition is not an option. Number 3. We need to talk about Kevin. Like many of the films explored here, Lynn Ramsey's adaptation of We Need to Talk About Kevin is most effective because of the strength of the performances holding it together. John C. Reilly is very good without anything showy, and Tilda Swinton is incredible. But it's the performances of Jasper Newell and even more so Ezra Miller as Kevin, their son who committed a high school massacre, that are most profound. Both kids are like daggers in your brain, awfully unhinged, sadistic, and almost satanic. And then, as we're told the story of what happened that day and we're shown the added tragedy of what Kevin did, murdering his father and younger sister as well as his schoolmates, it's almost too much to bear. Watching it again is almost like being complicit in the sadism. Number 2. United 93. The story of the 9/11 terrorist atrocities was always going to inspire filmmaking because art is most profoundly how we understand history, or at least how we re-engage with it to make it accessible and help us comprehend these tragedies. But those stories were so deeply traumatic and so close and personal that catching the right balance was also always likely to be a challenge. However, Paul Greengrass's haunting, heartbreaking elegy to the passengers on United Airlines Flight 93 manages the feat, and it's largely unprecedented. The film feels like a sort of waking funeral because the story has no hope, and there's no protective barrier between its start and its horrifying tragedy. You go in prepared and it wrings you out. While it's of course an important story to tell, it just feels so personal, and so it feels more like a haunting museum exhibit in the end. Number 1. The Revenant. There are lots of jokes about how Leonardo DiCaprio literally had to put himself through hell for the Academy to finally justifiably acknowledge his brilliance with a shiny hunk of metal. And that performative achievement is precisely why The Revenant is fundamentally a one-and-out experience. Bleached by cold sun, smothered in mud, blood and worse, and practically stinking off the screen, this torrid tale of frontiersman Hugh Glass's near-death, near-bear experience in 1823 is the very definition of an ordeal. You watch transfixed as DiCaprio drags his body through the most unimaginable horrors repeatedly over and over again until a happy ending involving a heavy wounding and the knowledge that the real Hugh Glass was killed by the same tribe that spared him in the movie 10 years later. If you want to watch that all over again, are you okay?